I think we can begin. Yeah. Roman, should we begin the program?
Should I now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Dear colleagues, friends, and PHN comrades, it is for me an honor to introduce this webinar on the risks of war and the increasing conflict in Asia on behalf of People Health Movement. We human beings know what the meaning of conflicts and war are. We know that war brings to us a lot of suffering, destruction, diseases, and death. We know that because of our long historical experience, not only related to countries' internal or regional conflict, but because we have lived two war in the previous century. So we understand very well what the risks are regarding the actual situation in East and Pacific Asia. The change in the balance of power between major powers in the region and also the geopolitical tensions between major nations in the world are creating a situation in which the risk of war becomes a reality, and we need to think seriously about it. The change in the balance of power between China, Japan, Austria, and between between China and the United States and other nations in the region, and the emerging military alliance, put threat to life, to health, and the survival of human beings and all other expression of life in the planet. So we need to understand very carefully what the situation is that we have to confront at the moment. Major power strategic competition are strengthening military alliances. Of course, this is provoking confrontation between parties, and there is also producing the deployment of strategic forces and the threat of nuclear confrontation is a reality as well. All these movements aggravate the risk of nuclear arms race and nuclear proliferation in the region. PHM has been a movement committed to peace since the beginning of its existence. In PHM, Charter for Health, we state clearly that war, violence, conflict, and natural disasters devastate communities and destroy human dignity. They have a severe impact on the physical and mental health of their members, especially women and children. Increase arms procurement and an aggressive and corrupt international arms trade undermines social, political, and economic stability and the allocation of resources to the social sector. This is what we state 22 years ago when we released the Charter for Health. We call on people of the world to support campaigns and movements for peace and disarmament, support campaigns against aggression, and the research, production, testing, and use of weapons of mass destruction and other arms, including all types of landmines. We also call to support people's initiative to achieve a just and lasting peace, especially in countries with experiences of civil war and genocide. We call the United Nations Security Council a radical transformation so that it functions democratically. We also call and demand that the United Nations and individual states end all kinds of sanctions used as an instrument of aggression which can damage the health of civilian population. We call everybody in the world to organize, mobilize through the commitment of peace to secure health for all and to secure the life of every human being, regardless of socio-economic condition, ethnic, racial condition, or gender situation. That is PHN call. So in this seminar, the reflection of our friends, colleagues, and comrades are going to illustrate you what the situation is that we are living in Asia and what the risk of war is at the moment and how can we stop that threat and challenge the powers promoting situation of conflict and risk of war. So welcome to this seminar that is going to illustrate you on how to proceed regarding the situation in which we are just now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roman, for introducing the webinar and placing this discussion firmly in the context of the global people's struggle for health. My name is Paul Laris. I'm Regional Coordinator for the People's Health Movement for the Southeast Asia and Pacific region. And I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Before we proceed, I'd also like to acknowledge that this is International Safe Abortion Day, and I salute all those working to make abortions safe, legal, accessible, and rare all around the globe. Our aim in the discussion today will be to do three things, I should say. We'll be exploring regional concerns about rising tensions between the USA and China and the risks of armed conflict. We'll be looking at the potential consequences for people's health, and we'll be asking what can be done by PHM and by citizens of the region to minimise that risk. We're very fortunate in that we have a panel of 4 people very well qualified to address these issues, and I'll introduce them as we proceed. I'll be moderating, obviously, and each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience, and we expect to go on for around 90 minutes in all. Our first speaker is Professor Ken Hammond. Ken Hammond is Professor of History at New Mexico State University. His research focuses on the cultural and intellectual history of China. He's worked with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing and has an affiliated fellowship with the International Institute for Asian Studies at Leiden in the Netherlands. He's shone light on the myths and facts about Xinjiang, and he provides a historical context for the contemporary demonisation of China. I should add that Ken's no stranger to controversy. He was active in political events that culminated in the May 4th, 1970 shootings at Kent State University. People of my generation will remember 4 dead in Ohio. Ken was indicted and subsequently acquitted as one of the Kent 25. He was appointed director of the Confucius Institute at New Mexico State University, a cultural initiative funded in part by Hanban, which is a kind of Chinese equivalent of the British Council or Alliance Française, and was dedicated to studying and publicizing China and Chinese culture. The Confucius Institute was closed in 2020 due to political pressure from the federal government. Ken, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was a very nice, very nice introduction. I'm very honored to be here today. It's great. I respect very much the work that the People's Health Movement does, and so it's when I was invited to take part in this particular event, it was very gratifying, and I'm very pleased to be here today. As a historian and kind of as the lead off here today, what I want to do is put the present situation into a historical context so that we can understand it as a dynamic which is taking place in the world and as something which needs to be recognized and taken seriously that way, rather than simply as sort of a disturbance on the surface of daily events, if you will. That what we're involved with here are deep reconfigurations of global relationships, and that the danger, the great danger that Rowan was talking about, of war, particularly between the United States and China, stems from the failure, really, primarily on the part of the United States, to recognize and sort of adjust itself to these changes that are happening in the world. So to put that into a larger...
Can I just interrupt you for a moment? We've just had a request from the interpreters. Could you slow down a little bit? I think I'm probably just as guilty.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Trying to pack a lot into 10 minutes. But to put the present crisis into a little longer perspective, what we are dealing with now is a major reconfiguration or reorientation in global relationships, not just between the United States and China, but on a sort of all-encompassing basis. But certainly within that, the relationship between the United States and China is at the heart of things. Those are the two probably most important economies in the world today. The United States, of course, continues to possess overwhelming military force. China is all reaching out to countries around the world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, in various ways, redesigning, reconfiguring quite a range of relationships. The present order, or what has been the present order, the system that we're moving away from, is the result of an earlier reconfiguration in global relationships going back to the early 19th century. At that point, the world for a long time had been one in which China played a really, really prominent and critical role. In the year 1800, China accounted for about a third of all global economic activity, all global economic production. That begins to change very rapidly with the rise of the Industrial Revolution in the West. And what that leads to and there's a long, complex history of the rise of industrialism that we don't need to worry about specifically right now. What's important is that the rise of modern industrial productive technologies and everything that went with those created the capacity for a small number of Western powers, Western European and eventually North American powers, to come to dominate most of the world. And they established a kind of system of global hegemony based on their monopoly of these modern productive technologies. There were, of course, reactions against this, countercurrents, which emerged. And by the beginning of the 20th century, we see both sort of reactions against industrial capitalism, imperialism within the Western world, things like the socialist and communist movements in Europe, and of course the Bolshevik Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union that starts to pursue its own separate track of industrial development, and the widespread anti-colonial movements all around the world in which people rose up against the European oppressors, the European powers, and struggled to free themselves and reestablish their countries as independent states. Now that process goes on primarily in the first half of the 20th century. And by 1950, a lot of change is underway. In 1949, of course, both the communist, anti-imperialist, and the anti-colonialist elements come together in China with the success of the revolution and the creation of the People's Republic. For the next 30 years, China struggled to find a correct path, a good path forward to build a modern socialist industrial society. And that was a challenging process that by 1978, 1979 led to the final emergence of a system that today still is sort of characteristic of China, which is one that the Chinese refer to as their policies of reform and opening to the rest of the world. Basically, this has been an effort by the Chinese to use market mechanisms, to use the economics of markets to develop their productive economy, to enhance the material livelihood of the Chinese people, while under the leadership of the Communist Party, maintaining a system that seeks to benefit people rather than simply generate profits for a wealthy elite. That is a complex and challenging process, and it's a work in progress, I suppose we could say. It's an ongoing effort that is by no means a done deal or a fully resolved situation. But for a while, in the 1980s especially, and even in the 1990s and the beginning of the present century, this led to a situation in which America, as by that point the leading power in the capitalist world, was very pleased to develop its new relationship with China after Nixon went there in 1972. And the hope amongst American elites was that China would somehow, through its economic reform, be transformed politically into a country which could then be subordinated and incorporated into an American-led global capitalist system. And for a while, the Chinese leadership followed a course of what they called biding their time and building their capabilities, meaning that while they needed investment, capital, technology, information systems, organizational practices, things like that from the West, they did not, they kind of went along with the United States. They accommodated themselves to the United States. But as China began to succeed in its efforts to develop its economy and raise the livelihoods, the standard of living of its people, they became less dependent upon the West, more capable of pursuing their own development, and more capable of sharing in the process of development with other countries around the world. What that leads to is a dramatic turn of events a little over a decade ago, when the United States, under President Obama, announces its so-called pivot to Asia, a reorientation of American policy, which began to see China not as a potential sort of junior partner, but as a rival, as a force that was, from the point of view of American economic and political elites, threatening their domination and hegemony. At the same time, China, with the election of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiao as their national leaders, became more self-confident, more self-assertive, less willing to accommodate and subordinate themselves to American leadership or American hegemony in the world. And that has set up the situation that we have today, where American elites, based upon their anxiety, their fear that they're going to lose the domination, the wealth, the power, the privileges which they have enjoyed for many decades, in the wake or in the face of China's re-emergence into a world in which it is playing an increasingly significant role. So America is embarked on a variety of campaigns: the political demonization of China, military threats against China, the encroachment of American military forces, confrontations in the South China Sea or over Taiwan. Many, many ways in which the situation is quite dangerous. And as Roman said at the beginning, war is dangerous for all of us. It is probably, along with the environmental threats, the greatest threat to human public health that we face. So that's just an effort to put the present situation, the present conflicts, into a little deeper perspective, see them as part of the reconfiguration of global relationships and a return to a more multi-centric world within which the Chinese play a very, very significant role. So that's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken, for putting us into that historical context. I think things make a lot more sense when we can see it through that lens rather than within the torrid media cycle that we get subjected to and we're expected to accept as the reality. I'd like now to introduce Professor Walton Bello. He is, I think, the consummate academic activist. He served as a member of the House of Representatives of the Philippines. He's an adjunct professor at Binghamton University, professor of sociology and administration at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and executive director of the regional policy think tank Focus on the Global South. He ran for vice presidency in the Philippine election earlier this year as the running mate of presidential candidate and Labour leader Leody de Guzman. Their platforms focused on a progressive, democratic, socialist and pro-poor systemic change. He's lived the global struggle for health in his writing and his actions. The US socialist worker described him as one of the most articulate and prolific voices on the international left, and that he has devoted most of his life to fighting imperialism and corporate globalization. Earlier this month, in a State of the World webinar organised by the Transnational Institute, of which he's a fellow, he pointed out that just as we are at increased risk of extreme climatic events, the geopolitical environment puts us at extreme risk of extreme political and military events. Roman, thank you. I'll give you Walton Bello. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks for that introduction. I think what this follows very much what Ken has said. Um, uh, and I think it's important to understand the events in the Taiwan Straits and in the South China Sea by bringing in the contemporary global economic background. China is now the center of global capital accumulation, or in the popular image, it is the quote unquote locomotive of the world economy, accounting for 28% of all growth worldwide in the 5 years from 2013 to 2018, more than twice the share of the United States. Now, China has been very careful not to be seen as replacing the United States. But nevertheless, I think this has not assuaged the fears of the American elite that that the United States will soon be replaced as what they call the global hegemon by China. Now, while China, is very careful and hesitates to be seen as stepping into the shoes of the United States, the U.S. Essentially is trying to redress what it feels is, a disadvantageous situation by resorting to that dimension, which is where it continues to enjoy an absolute advantage, and that is the military superiority. While China has been modernizing its military, it has avoided engaging the US in an arms race. For the last several years, US military spending has outpaced China's by a ratio of 3-1, and that has been consistent. Beijing's strategic nuclear arsenal is small compared to the United States. Its naval offensive capabilities provided by 3 aircraft carriers with a Soviet era 1970s design. Its strategic orientation, even the Pentagon admits, is defensive. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that in certain areas, such as the South China Sea, China does not engage in the tactical offensive. And it does this in the South China Sea, where it seeks to extend its defensive perimeter outwards to protect its coastal industrial heartland in the south and southeastern China. So while the press has really highlighted these moves as offensive operations, in essence, they are really defensive. So in sum, Beijing is not devoting its attention and is devoting comparatively little of its resources to playing catch up with the United States strategically. Now, in contrast, the US has scores of bases surrounding China located in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and the Philippines. In addition to the 7th Fleet, which sails in the South China Sea 10 months out of 12. The US's naval offensive punch is delivered by 11 carrier task forces grouped around modern supercarriers, like the state-of-the-art USS Gerald Ford. Now, Washington has deployed intermediate nuclear weapons in the Pacific following its withdrawal from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2020. Now, in contrast to China's strategic posture, that of the Pentagon has always been unabashedly offensive, and its current warfighting strategy is called air-sea battle, which has China explicitly as its target. One analyst summarizes one key air-sea battle document of detailing how, in the event of conflict with China, there would be, and I quote, explosive and electronic strikes against inland command centers, radar systems, and intelligence gathering facilities, raids against missile production and storage facilities, and blinding operations against Chinese satellites. It is also said that China's seaborne trade flows would be cut off with an eye towards exerting major stress on the Chinese economy and eventually internal stress, unquote. Um, Trump, under his administration, put the emphasis on squeezing China trade-wise and technologically by putting a halt to sensitive technology exports or sharing with China. That has not really yielded the results that that the U.S. elite wanted. And so the Biden administration has moved the focus to the military front. Its latest move is being to bring in North American treaty, North Atlantic treaty organizations, naval vessels from Europe to regularly patrol the South China Sea, along with ships from Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. Now, critics have rightfully decried the escalation of both aggressive rhetoric and the actual deployments as enhancing the possibility of armed conflict, since with no rules of engagement, a ship collision could easily escalate into a higher form of conflict. Now, raising the existential threat to China by displaying its military superiority is, however, only one objective of the Biden administration's policies. Equally important is the use of military superiority to influence China's internal politics. Now, this was, in my view, the thrust of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan a few weeks ago, which took place a few days after a US destroyer passed through the Taiwan Straits. It was the deployment of a military threat to provoke a political crisis in China. In this case, the aim, in my view, was to destabilize the leadership of the Communist Party of China by showing that the US could go back on its one China policy and brazenly support Taiwan without Beijing being able to do anything owing to its fear of US power. So, so this was not, so the deployments of the US in the Pacific directed at China is not just to, pose an existential threat. They do pose that, but in the short term, what they want to do is influence or bring about some kind of regime change within Beijing, and therefore weaken basically the political leadership in China. And there are very credible results that, especially within the Chinese military, what was perceived as relatively mild and largely symbolic response to the Biden-Pelosi provocation, was apparently reported in the higher leadership circles in China. So I would just like to say, therefore, that one, we have an extremely dangerous situation in the South China Sea. Secondly, that China's military posture is defensive, whereas that of the United States is offensive. And three, that pose an existential threat to China, but to promote some kind of regime change that would weaken the Chinese leadership at this point in time. So with that, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Walden. I understand that you're unable to stay for the Q&A, which is a shame. I'm sure would be interested, people would be interested to explore some of those ideas further. But thank you very much for those insights, and I'm sure we will be exploring them further as we go on. So thank you again.
Thank you too.
Our third speaker is Dr. Toru Honda. Toru Honda is a clinician and an activist. He's recently been doing clinical work in a remote mountainous village in Fukushima. His experience of the impact of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster in 2011 has made him acutely aware of the risks to public health posed by a collective failure to acknowledge the risk of disasters and to prepare for them. He wrote in The Lancet in 2019, and I'll quote, "The most blatant proof of our vulnerability is the nuclear accident that happened in Fukushima. More than 40,000 people are still displaced from their hometowns and villages and have no hopes or prospects of going back to normality in the foreseeable future. Environmental radioactive contamination is widespread in Fukushima and will be for years to come." As Walton Bello has just pointed out, that Japan and Australia are among the supporters of the belligerent behaviour of the USA over Taiwan. Australia with its AUKUS agreement, and Japan with the Japan-US Status of Forces agreement. Japan has, and I understand, largely pays for some 50,000 US service personnel on about 8 bases, all of which could become targets in a war with China. There is increasing popular dissatisfaction with the US presence, especially in Okinawa, and Japan ostensibly has a pacifist constitution, but for how long? And what risk is posed to health by Taiwan's 3 nuclear power stations in the event of war? Toru, you had a document. Do you want to share the screen as you go through this?
Paul, is it possible that I share with you my slides, the sharing of the,
I will just do that.
will it be possible?
Yep.
If it's not technically possible, I will read out my.
I think it's being arranged. I hope it's being arranged.
I think you should be able to share the screen now.
Really? Okay.
Yep.
I'll try.
Yep.
Can you see them?
Half of it.
Half
We only
of
have half of it. Yeah.
it? Sorry. I'll try again. Sorry. I'm sorry.
There would be a button that says share screen.
Yeah, I think so. I'll
Yeah.
try again. Sorry. There's no file that I put in. Okay, I'll try later on to put my documents in the chat box. So I'll start because my time is limited. So
If
thank
you can email, then I mean, I can share and then we can use it in that fashion.
Okay.
There you go.
Well, very sorry. I'll try it later, but anyway, I'll start talking.
Okay.
As Paul introduced me, I'm a NGO person, and at the same time, at this moment, I'm working in the countryside of Fukushima prefecture, devastated by a nuclear accident, as you remember, back in 2011. Now, I'll talk about a little bit the former recent incident about Shinzo Abe's assassination. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's assassination unintentionally shed light on the hidden awkward truth about Japanese politics. Abe had a strong relationship with so-called Unification Church, originated in South Korea. Maybe some of you remember that Abe's grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke, a former prime minister, but at the same time war criminal, he reigned from 1957 to 1960. And Kishi was the person who first recognized and allied with Unification Church, because this organization's strength of anti-communism has a lot in common with Kishi's political conviction. Actually, Kishi was a mainstay for Japan-US military alliance. Later on, the church's unlawful fundraising activity, namely fortune-telling fraud, led to bankruptcy many believer families in Japan. The criminal person of Abe's assassination is actually a son of such a victimized family and have had a long and strong grudge against Abe. An inconvenient truth of this tragic event for the ruling Conservative Party of Japan is that part of the fund the Unification Church collected from Japanese citizens has been channeled through to Communist North Korea that abducted many Japanese in the past. On the other hand, Japan has a very sinful past of military colonialism of 19th and 20th centuries, particularly in Korean Peninsula and China. Our imperialistic Great Asian Prosperity Sphere dream was crushed in disaster in 1945. We Japanese will not allow Russian military aggression in Ukraine, and will not tolerate China's oppressive policies in Uyghurs or Hong Kong. But for that, we have to seriously face and repent our own past atrocities. To regain the real independence toward US and re-evaluate our bilateral military partnership, we will have to be much more courageous and strategy mindfulness. But the prospect for our growth and maturity in that direction is hopelessly limited. This is my rather pessimistic evaluation at this moment. And now I'm living in Fukushima, and still more than 30,000 people are evacuated and far away from their own homes. And I'm living in one mountainous village called Itate village, and I paid visit to many patients living alone in a very lonely situation, especially old persons. More than 60% of the total population in Itate village is older than 65 years old. So how can we maintain and sustain those who are living alone or passing a very hopelessly lonely situation in the faraway villages, mountainous villages, and who don't have convenient ways or means of transportation. And we will try our best to extend support to these people with ailments and loneliness and poverty. So we have to cope with the environmental disaster and at the same time the social security issues for people who are mostly abandoned. So that's what we are tackling with at this moment. So in a great global picture, we have to cope with the situation in China, situation in Ukraine, and so forth. But at the same time, how to maintain and keep up with our so-called social welfare country in Japan. That's our issue, and hoping, and we hope to cope with these difficult issues for days to come. That's my temporary presentation, and I will put my documents in my chat box. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Toru. I think that yeah, in Australia we can resonate with your pessimistic assessment that we too will have to be much more courageous and strategy minded if we're going to ensure that we escape the perils of armed conflict. I'd like now to introduce Sue Warham. Sue is one of the founders of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, who were awarded the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. She's president of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War and the Secretary of Australians for War Powers Reform. The Medical Association for the Prevention of War has campaigned, so far without success, to encourage the Australian government to live up to a pre-election commitment to ratify the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Sue is driven by an awareness of the potential horrendous public health impacts of war. Through her writing and campaigning, she shone a spotlight on the ways in which Australia has prioritised warfare over healthcare. She's exposed the contrast between the neglect of diplomacy for peace and the capture of state and media by lobbyists such as the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who are strongly influenced by and partly funded by the military-industrial complex and seem intent on demonising China. Sue, please explain how this has all come about and what we can do about it. And you're muted.
Is that better? Can you hear me well? Okay.
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And it's a great delight to be part of this panel. So thank you and congratulations to the People's Health Movement for organising this forum, because it is so important that health, I must slow down, sorry, that health professionals and health advocates unite, particularly in the case of a possible war. I'm speaking from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in what is now called Canberra, and pay respects to all the traditional owners of the lands in Australia. And I speak in full awareness of the fact that my country, Australia, is a big part of the problem that we are facing, having been complicit in just about every modern US war. Paul, you've given an outline of what MAPW, Medical Association for Prevention of War, does, the name, more or less gives away why we exist. We have a particular focus on nuclear weapons, which you mentioned. The talking up of war with China has become very loud in Australia. We seem to have much more alarmist statements here about China than there are in countries that are much closer to China. We see a total marginalizing of non-violent ways to reduce tensions, and we hear constant references in our media to Chinese aggression and Chinese assertiveness, while, as has been pointed out, our media generally ignore the fact that the US spends more on its military than the next 9 biggest spenders combined. So we hear very biased interpretations here. So what's the role of health professionals and health advocates in all of this? Well, I think one role for us is to continue to point out that war is a health disaster, and a war between two military giants, one much more gigantic than the other, but two military giants nevertheless. Such a war should be unthinkable. And the fact that the US and China are both nuclear armed takes the risk to a totally different level. We're all aware, I'm sure, that a nuclear war could begin by intention or by accident, and it would probably be terminal for big chunks of the planet. Recent updates of nuclear winter research confirm reports and add to reports that in the aftermath of a nuclear war, the nuclear winter effect would cause famine, basically famine for billions of people because of blocking of sunlight, reduction of rain, crop failures, etc. Now, in a just world, just and sensible world, all of this would be sufficient to make our leaders step back and say, war must not go ahead. We need to find other ways. But we know that evidence is not sufficient to bring about good policy, tragically. So we must do more. One of the ways that I think health professionals and others can approach this problem is to try to undermine the war machine itself, the networks, the institutions, the corporations that need war for their existence, and the institutions that tell us that there is no other way. We need to, I think, take away the social license of the war profiteers, the companies that can't survive without war and tensions. In Australia, we see that this is an issue that MAPW has worked on. The weapons industry has spread itself right through our education system, with particularly at universities, but also down to primary school level, with the explicit goal of attracting the best science, technology, engineering, and math students, the explicit goal of attracting those students to the weapons industry. So we need to absolutely need to undermine this. MAPW has a report which some might be interested in, called Minors, MINORS, Minors and Missiles, which gives an outline of this problem, and it's on our website. MAPW is working to change policies that allow these vested interests in our schools. The weapons industry, as you mentioned, Paul, also helps to fund think tanks, which are telling us that war is coming, there is no other way, and there's no point opposing that. And a particular problem in this respect is ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which plays a key role in advising government on defence and security matters, and in recent times has become almost hysterical in its warmongering towards China. ASPI also receives significant funding from the US State Department and the US Defense Department and appears to be almost a mouthpiece for those institutions. MAPW is planning research to look at this particular problem. I won't say more about that now in the interest of time. Talking at war has a number of dangers, and not only the intended result of making us believe that there is no other way, war is inevitable. One of the dangers is an impact which is already occurring, and that is the impact on Chinese Australians as they start to feel a bit less welcome in this country and increasingly under scrutiny and suspicion about where their loyalties actually lie. But it is not all bleak in Australia. We, as most of you will be aware, certainly the Australians, we have a new government since May. We have a Labor government, which on some fronts is more progressive. They have given us more hope of perhaps reining in this militarism a little, but unfortunately on that front, the hopes have not been fulfilled. We still have the very destabilising and provocative AUKUS agreement, AUKUS being Australia, the UK and the United States, which was negotiated by the previous government, but the Labor government still gives no intention at all of rethinking, renegotiating. So with the three AUKUS countries, three Anglo nations, starting to encircle even more than previously, encircle China, it's really hard not to see this in racist terms. We hear a lot about the rule of law in relation to AUKUS, but AUKUS is about US supremacy. That's what it's about. Now, of all the elements of AUKUS, there are a lot of military initiatives in it. Of all the elements, the most provocative and the most controversial is the proposal for nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. This proposal has big challenges. It might not ever come off. There are key questions about where the submarines would be built, where their home ports would be. There's also an absolutely eye-watering economic cost of probably in excess of $170 billion. And there's the nuclear weapons proliferation risk. Now, in relation to where the submarines might have a home base, Australians have traditionally, for very good reason, as Dr. Toru Honda has reminded us, for very good reason, Australians generally reject having a nuclear reactor in their backyard. The submarine proposal is deeply unpopular with a lot of people, and it's probably the best campaign target for those of us who want to undermine the AUKUS proposal. The submarine proposal is probably the best place to focus our efforts. We need to challenge the secrecy around it. We've been told virtually nothing about AUKUS, despite its huge implications. So we need to challenge the secrecy, the risks associated with it, and we need to undermine public trust at every level in the AUKUS agreement. I'm just going to say a wee bit more about the nuclear war risks, and I want to again promote the only thing that is leading us towards a nuclear weapons-free world, and that is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which you mentioned, Paul, which prohibits all aspects of nuclear weapons, development, testing, production, assistance, everything else associated with them, and it's the only agreement that does that. The ban treaty, as we call it now, has 68 states parties. It's part of international humanitarian law, and there are an additional 23 countries that have signed but not yet ratified. So earlier I said that governments tend not to pay sufficient heed to the health implications of war. When it comes to nuclear weapons, that's actually not so much the case. It was the health and humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons that which are so overwhelming that most governments realise that these weapons must never be used. And those impacts were the driving force for the achievement of the ban treaty, and they remain its very foundation. So I think as health professionals and health advocates, we have a huge continuing role in promoting the treaty to all the governments that are not yet party to it. And certainly that remains, as you mentioned, Paul, a goal for us in Australia, to ensure that the Australian government, the Labor government, fulfills its promise to sign and ratify the treaty. Before finishing, I think I'm probably over time, I'm sorry. I just want to mention briefly another aspect of militarism, which I think is very useful for us to focus on because it links the peace movements and the environmental movements, and that's the greenhouse gas emissions from military activity. These emissions are huge, and they are currently exempt from mandatory reporting under the UN framework on climate change. So this must change. We need to ensure that military greenhouse gas emissions are both counted and recorded, and that they are reduced. And this agenda also is one that MAPCA will be pushing, especially over the next couple of months before the next conference of parties to the UN climate change framework, which will be in November. So I'll finish off. I just want to repeat that the health-related links between peace and health in our region are extremely important right now, and dialogues like this one are very valuable. And to whatever extent we can, I think we need to extend these dialogues. If we can include health professionals and advocates in China, despite the great difficulties in doing that, then so much the better. We really need to normalise the process of talking about peace and the inextricable links between peace and health. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was terrific and very comprehensive. We now have time for questions from the panel. Yotsna, how do we handle that? Do they come through the chat box, or how do we do this?
Yes, I think chat box will be the best idea. And if you want at some point that you would like somebody to speak, let me know. I can do that. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we're open for questions from the floor. I might kick off with one, take the privilege of mediating and asking a question at the same time, and I guess it's more of perhaps it's more of a comment than a question, but I just, because of the importance of this this webinar being focused on the region, I did a little bit of research, and I just noted that I'll just read out a list of countries in this region that all have something in common: Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, New Zealand, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, and all the nations of the Pacific Islands family. What they all have in common is that they have ratified the ban on nuclear weapons. So those that haven't, the obvious omission, of course, is Australia, but and I think Japan also has yet to ratify. So I think this highlights the position across the region in terms of wanting to prevent war and working towards peace, compared to the position of some of the nations that are more linked with the demonization of China and the US hegemonic military approach. But that's my comment, I suppose, rather than the question. But I would like to take questions now from the floor.
Well, could I just make a quick comment on what you've just stated, Paul?
Yeah, please do.
Thanks. Yes, thanks for reminding us of all the support within the region for the nuclear weapons ban treaty. And I think it's worth reminding us, because this is often helpful in advocacy, that under the terms of the treaty, it's still possible to have an alliance with a nation that is nuclear armed, as long as the states party to the treaty, of course, doesn't play any role in facilitating nuclear weapons use or threats or anything. And in Australia, that's been fairly helpful, because while many people individually have serious doubts about our alliance with the United States, when we're advocating to government, we need to be able to say, you must sign this treaty, you must sign and ratify, and it is entirely consistent to maintain an alliance with the United States, as long as we're not agreeing to any US nuclear weapons policies. So just in case that's helpful for advocates on this meeting.
Thanks very much, Sue. Yes, diplomacy all the time. We have a question for Ken from Fran Baum. Ken, as a seasoned activist, what anti-war activities or activism do you think would be most effective in the current environment?
Great question. I guess that I would think that this is a situation in which thinking of anti-war activism, it's always a situation in which one needs to sort of advance on two legs. That on the one side, education is always really critical. Making sure or making whatever efforts we can to ensure, as people in this webinar have done a very good job of, that the facts, the realities about things are out there, are available for people, and are communicated to people as broadly and as effectively as possible. The differences in military budgets, where bases are actually located, who is benefiting from military contracts, things like that. So knowledge, information, education, always an important arena. But that, I believe, needs to be conjoined with whatever forms of direct action also present themselves. So obviously, protests, demonstrations at military facilities, again, as part of it's actually educational in its own way, drawing attention to the existence of these facilities and the role that they play, the function that they have in enhancing the risks of war and conflict. But other kinds of direct action, I think, also, those are very situational to see what opportunities present themselves. But I think a combination of education and action is always what we need to do.
Thank you very much, Ken. I couldn't agree more. And throughout the region, we have plenty of choices in terms of US military facilities if we might want to take some direct action towards. We have another question, and this is for Sue. Again, I think from Fran. Fran, what can the People's Health Movement activists and country circles do to support MAPW work? How might we collaborate? And you're muted again, Sue.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't see the question. It disappeared from my view. How can People's Health Movement people collaborate with MAPW and others? There's just so much potential. As I mentioned, I think collaboration, dialogues, particularly with people in different countries around the region, is really important. And as Ken has just said, building up the education basis about the health risks of war in the region, and the solidarity around that, normalizing the process of talking about peace. There are a number of specific projects where anybody who would like to would be extremely welcome to join MAPW and take part in these various projects. But other organisations and individuals working in parallel is extremely valuable too. I think for MAPW, we've decided to focus quite a bit, not exclusively, but quite a bit on the weapons industry, because it is so pervasive in Australian society. The weapons industry in education, if there are people in education who have got some insights there or links with people in education, then be helpful for us to work together. The issue of media, how do the media report defence and security matters in Australia and elsewhere, I'm sure. Working with journalists to try to highlight the problem and suggest other spokespeople other than those who are funded by the weapons industry. The nuclear weapons work, there's a lot to do there, even though parliamentarians in Australia are a high percentage of federal parliamentarians, at least on the government Labor side, are supportive of Australia signing the treaty. We still need to reinforce that, and we need to hold Labor accountable to their promise to sign and ratify. So working with parliamentarians, working with local councils, cities to get them to sign on to the city's appeal. There's a lot. Maybe I'd be happy to be in a discussion offline if anybody would like to progress this further, and there's the MAPW website too. I've probably forgotten stuff.
No, that's great. That's pretty comprehensive. Thank you, Sue. And I'm sure that those opportunities will arise, because I'm sure there's lots of people in PHM in Australia and elsewhere in the region who would be interested in linking up. We have a question here from Chan Chi Kun. He said, especially for Walton Bellow, but I think Walton Bellow's had to leave and go and give a lecture at the University of Massachusetts. But the question is, are Singapore and the Philippines violating the Treaty of Bangkok? It's an ASEAN, I'm not sure what NWFZ is, in allowing port visits of nuclear-armed warships. I don't know if anyone else is able to comment on that, if Walton's gone. I know that there are certainly restrictions on nuclear-armed warships in certain ports in this region, but I'm not sure about the Singapore and the Philippines. But nobody seems to know the answer to that one. Roman Vega is asking you, Toru. He said this week people celebrate the 50th years of Japan-China normalization of diplomatic relationships.
Yeah.
What? I can see that amuses you. Can you tell me what is your view on the meaning of this for today and the risks of war?
Well, the meaning was almost abolished, I think, under the current situation. I'm very sorry to see this very saddening relationship between the two countries. We were expecting to invite Mr. Xi Jinping to Japan on the occasion of 50th anniversary, but the current landscape between the two countries and also the global landscape, especially the Ukrainian war, cast a very dark shadow bilateral relations especially, well, I'm not really a patriot, but at the same time, we feel kind of threats. It's not an existential threat, but the way China is behaving its own people, especially in Hong Kong or Uyghur region or Tibetan autonomy areas. We are a little bit concerned about the way the Chinese government is behaving its own people. So that's how we are now rather worried about. But at the same time, we have to maintain and we have to seriously apologize what we have done during the past. During the World War II, the atrocities we committed toward the Chinese people. So now it's a very, very complicated and delicate situation, and I don't know which direction we are headed, and we hope that the issue will be, we can find some way of finding solution to find a kind of modus vivendi, the kind of coexistence between the two people without war, only through the diplomacy and trustfulness between the two people. I hope so. Sorry.
No, thank you, Toru. I see Japan is in a very difficult position now, being pulled one way by the United States and still having this obvious close relationship with China. It's, yeah, between the devil and the deep blue sea, as we say. We have a question also from Karsing Chua to everyone, and they say the most relevant peoples to be educated regarding peace and war, health and war, and the problem with nuclear war should be first and foremost our political leaders who make decisions for us. How do we do it to change, say, Biden and the US leaders especially? Ken, any suggestions on how we can change the US leadership?
Sure, that's obviously the one of the biggest challenges. I fear I'm not particularly optimistic on changing the mind or the consciousness or the orientation of President Biden or Secretary of State Blinken or leadership of the House or the Senate in the United States. I don't think that the problems in the American orientation towards China are a result of their not having a good understanding of things. I think they are the expression of particular political interests that are widely shared by the economic and political elites in the United States. I do think, of course, that political mobilization, that we have midterm elections taking place in the United States in a little over a month. Those are important in that people can express, their views. People can, raise issues with campaigning politicians and all that. But I don't think that targeting the existing leadership like that in and of itself is going to be a really successful venture in terms of changing something as profound as the American hostility towards China. I think rather that what we need to do, and certainly events like this are part of this, is to work to build a broader, if one dare use the idea of a mass movement, a widespread movement, not so much directed at particular politicians or even political parties, but simply at articulating opposition to war, opposition to the hostility, looking instead in the direction of how countries, even countries with profoundly different systems like the United States and China, can find ways to cooperate and collaborate. Delinking those kinds of things from the existing political policies. You know, politicians get very, very defensive. And so rather than, you know, trying to say, well, you need to change your mind about this, it would be perhaps more useful to build movements that say, you know, why not try, you know, other alternatives? Why not try finding areas of common concern? You know, certainly there's plenty of things on which the United States and China could cooperate and collaborate in terms of environmental policy, technological development, public health, many, many opportunities. So I think that, you know, obviously, political campaigning, political intervention remains important, but I think not so much focusing on individual politicians and electoral campaigns, and more focusing on building deeper, broader movements to articulate these interests.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that opens up another range of opportunities. I'm also wondering about the degree to which popular attitudes towards China in the United States have changed over the last 5 or 10 years, and how that's come about. I mean, to what degree is that media manipulation? To what degree is it been sort of fueled partly by racism? If you have a view on that, I'd be interested to hear.
Well, I think that there's a number of factors. It's you know, there have been a variety of dynamics that have been interacting to create what has become a very, very tense situation. I mean, there's widespread. You know, this is not the hostility towards China is not just something that is being articulated by the political elites, although certainly, you know, there's a bipartisan consensus on that. And I'm afraid that has found, you know, a receptive audience among many people, largely because there is not a lot of direct knowledge or information in the United States about China. Most Americans, the only things that they hear or know about China are the things that they hear from politicians and from, you know, the sort of mainstream corporate media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, like that. And so, you know, the most Americans certainly don't speak Chinese or read Chinese or have any understanding of the realities of life in China. And so it becomes very easy for them to be persuaded by the rhetoric of politicians. And so it's, you know, this is a very, very big challenge for those of us working to try to, you know, de-intensify the antagonism. I work with an organization called Pivot to Peace, in contrast to the pivot to Asia, which we see as a pivot to war. And again, thinking of political activism, this is the big challenge: is education, is information, is knowledge. Because people act upon what they believe. And if the information that they have is inadequate or even simply, you know, false and distorted, they're going to be making political decisions that are not grounded in reality or in what is even in their own actual self-interests.
Good challenge. We've had a couple of comments. And I think along the lines of, I'll try and roll them up into one, that in the past there's been a big world movement against the threat of nuclear war. And I guess this question is addressed maybe particularly to Sue. What's the possibility of revitalizing the old CND, if you like, or something along that lines as a mass anti-war movement? Is there hope for something like that?
Definitely. I mean, I think really it's already happening. And the vehicle for revitalization has really been the process of achieving and getting into international law, and now strengthening the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And this has been the single, about the only thing that has united nuclear disarmament activists around the world. So it's not the only thing. But let's say it's by far and away the most effective thing that has been a galvanizing instrument for people around the world. And CMD, anti-nuclear organisations in lots of countries have been a big part of this process. So I think the answer to that really is for individuals just to get involved. There are ICANN groups in lots of countries. Most of them are doing a fabulous job, and there's always more that can be done. So we just need more people to get involved and to be outspoken with their own documents, particularly if their government has not signed and ratified the treaty. We just need boots on the ground doing this stuff. So it's happening, but yeah, it needs to get stronger and stronger, but it's there and happening.
Whoa. Thank you very much, Sue. Yeah, that gives us cause for hope, I think. And Chanchi Kuhn has pointed out that that visits by, particularly by US nuclear-powered ships or nuclear-armed vessels into ports in the region should also be a focus for citizens to raise their concerns, because that's what do they call it? A real and present danger when that happens. And of course, that would apply to the nuclear-powered submarines in Australian ports, or if built and used by the Australian Navy. We've now reached, we've gone for an hour and a half, and so I think it's probably time that we wound up. I'd just like to thank all our panelists very much for their contribution, and I'd like also to be able to ask them all if you just have a final message, perhaps, from each of you to health activists in the region, just in a few words. What would you like to leave us with? I'll ask you first, Ken.
Well, I think that, you know, for activists, health activists, political activists, the key thing is just never stop, you know, never give up, even when things look very bleak. So I would just say, you know, keep going.
Be a realist, demand the impossible.
Absolutely.
Sue, what are your final words to the activists?
Yeah, totally agree with that. Keep going, because this work was never going to be easy. But get involved, and particularly get involved with ICANN. If there are other aspects of the militarism, what's the word I want? Steamrolling that we're subject to, then pick an issue where there might be some success. We can't try to tackle the whole thing, so I think pick an issue where the militarism is vulnerable and work on it, either way at it. If that's nuclear weapons, that's great. That's our overwhelming threat. And if it's something else, then so be it. But keep going.
Thanks very much, Sue. Toru, do you have some final words for us?
Thank you so much. It was a great honor to be invited here to participate in your discussion. Although my language limitations are great, but I enjoyed this session very much. And I'm sorry that I couldn't put my documents into the chat box. So maybe someone who wants to get these documents, please write to me through maybe Paul or something. And I hope we can keep up with your cooperation together in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toru. I think the words that you said earlier about we will have to be much more courageous and strategy-minded is so apt. So thank you, and thanks also to Walton Bello, who had to leave earlier. Yotsna, I understand this has been recorded, and so that will be available for people who want to have a look at it subsequently.
Yeah, absolutely. And because it was YouTube Live, the English version is on YouTube already. I will share the link soon. Yeah.
That's terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Raman, for introducing it. And thank you to our interpreters as well, who I'm sure have done a splendid job. So thank you, everyone. Good night, and continue. The struggle for health is the struggle for peace. Good night, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning.
Oh, good morning.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Right.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All good?
I'm stopping the call now. Yeah, I'll just stop.
Okay. Thanks you. Thank you.